If you find yourself frequently dealing with price objections and you don't really know what to do to remedy that, then this video is for you. So last week I sat down with Christopher Walken, who owns C-Suite Limo out of Palm Beach, Florida. And we had about a 45-minute conversation about how he went from software engineer to in the ground transportation business. And there were definitely a few nuggets along the way that I'm going to discuss here about qualifying your prospects. What's the perfect line to say to someone to ensure they're the right customer? But really the most important thing was an overall concept, mindset sort of thing that I think is really lacking. And I generally find that the guys that get the most pushback on pricing have one thing in common. And then finally, I'm going to go over, a few things. I actually even learned that I don't know if I had heard before, but seem kind of obvious in retrospect. There are certain times and days where business is just usually better. So advertising and making sure you are on the ball on those days is super important. Okay, so first of all, Christopher told me a story about how when he was working full-time as an engineer, he started actually doing Uber, might have been Uber Black on the side. And he went above and beyond. He actually had the old school chauffeur hat, the white gloves, the suit, everything. You don't see that kind of stuff these days. And some people might even laugh and think, man, that seems excessive. That seems crazy. I guarantee you there were other Uber Black drivers who probably thought it was a little ridiculous. Well, I guarantee you they probably wouldn't have thought his tips he was making at the time were ridiculous, and the number of repeat customers he got was ridiculous. Here's what Christopher understood early on in his career, and maybe he's always understood it. I didn't really understand this until a little bit later in my business career. That is that you really always want to give, like the value. And it might be part cultural here in the United States or just in the whole Western world that this is a thing, but it's a very, very big thing, reciprocity. And so reciprocity is just a fancy word for if you do for someone, they're going to feel indebted to you. Now, again, not every culture is like this, but it's definitely like this in the U.S. and I imagine many Western type countries. And so he would always go above and beyond. And I'm talking about not just, how he dressed, how he carried himself, really tried at all times to think, how can I be a little bit better? How can I do a little bit more? And while many operators claim they do these things, most do not. And he had a pretty potent insight, and it was that he believed, and I actually agree with him, that a lot of people don't give all this value, because they're afraid they might not get it back. They're afraid if they put themselves out, if they do in excess of what is expected or what's required, that they might be a sucker if it doesn't come back to them. And so, especially for those of you out there that maybe aren't originally from the United States, this is such a big thing. And it's actually, I believe, the cause of a few disagreements I've had in the past. And I didn't realize it wasn't anything to do with the person. It was a cultural thing. And so here is all about, United States, probably Western world in general. It really is all about giving without expecting to receive. But you always, when you do that, you always receive, and always in greater quantities than you give. It might not be immediate, but the sorts of clients that you're looking to attract, which are, let's be honest, very wealthy people, they didn't get wealthy without understanding this. Most millionaires, something like 70% of millionaires are first generation. Think about that for a minute. That's insane, right? Meaning most rich people got rich during their lifetime. They didn't inherit the money. Okay. And I'll tell you one thing. While, I'm not flying in private jets, just being a business owner, I notice smaller details. And anyone who's made it to higher up in a career, maybe it's a partner at a law firm, maybe it's, even some of you operators out there who own 7-figure businesses, you notice details. And you notice when someone goes above and beyond. And people like that, they will always reward you far, far in excess of the value you provide them. Now, I can't say this as a blanket statement, every single one of them, but there are, I would say the majority, probably the vast majority will, meaning you go the extra mile, you're likely going to get a very large tip, because when someone, especially someone who might not be from the same socioeconomic class, right? AKA someone who your client might make 10 million a year and you might make 50,000 a year. Well, that client who makes those big bucks, he is aware of the discrepancy. And so when you go out of your way to cater to them, that's when you get the really crazy big tips. And so Christopher, he's I guess understood this for a while, and he's even taken it to, I guess you'd call the hard product of the industry. So, I mean, most people, they just buy whatever, they buy a jet sprinter or a sprinter or whatever. They might get it, somewhat customized. Christopher's throwing a bathroom in the back of, these sprinters. And apparently that was something that got laughed at, but now more people are starting to do the same thing, which, by the way, makes a lot of sense to me. If you're on a trip or whatever, not having to pull over and use a public restroom is kind of nice. But the point being, not only on the service side, but he is trying to think, hey, how can I make this experience better for my clients? And so he told a story about Easter Sunday. He landed a pretty big client. While we cannot be sure, we can be pretty confident that he landed that client. Well, there's lots of reasons. Number one, he answered the phone on Easter Sunday, right? So that's always going to put you in a much smaller group. You're going to be competing with much less people when you do things like that. So he answered the phone, and it was a private jet broker. In some ways, I was surprised. So I had booked his interview a few days prior, and so he was telling me this story. It was the first time I heard it, and when I heard it, I'm like, wow, that's awesome. And it just so happened to be one of the leads he had gotten from our campaign. So it was a private jet broker, and he had a client flying in from into Palm Beach and flying into the private airport there. And I believe it was a golfing thing. They're going golfing a few days. Anyways, it ended up being a 5-figure job. But anyways, at the end of that first day, the client called the private jet broker and said, hey, I want to use this guy for the whole time. And it was the way Christopher handled the situation that built that relationship, because look, that private jet broker, he only cares about keeping his client happy, right? That's number one. And so you make him happy, when you make his client happy, and as you guys know, it's kind of like this with all, you could almost think of that as almost some sort of affiliate relationship, right? So now this private jet broker, well, I mean, there's not much better in this industry than hooking up with those sorts of connections. Obviously, travel agents, DMCs, things like that are contacts that can lead you to a huge pool of clients that are your ideal client. And so I wanted to make this video because it's, if I had a nickel for every time I heard, there's pricing issues and people are cheap, and without getting too psychoanalytical, and if you found yourself saying that, generally people are talking about themselves, right? And it's very hard to change your frame to the frame of someone who might make 100 times more than you, or even 10 times more. What are their values? What do they care about? It's very hard to think that way, because the truth is, if you thought that way, you would probably be you would probably be closer to where they're at financially. The main thing I have found is wealthy people are generally, as a whole, most they notice details. Most want to help out someone who is trying to help themselves. And that's probably the biggest thing, is when you see someone who is trying to make it work, giving it their all, especially if they have any sort of disadvantage. Are they an immigrant? Disadvantage. English isn't their first language? Disadvantage. Well, it's not the immigrant so much as it's the English isn't their first language. That makes it much more difficult. But the clients you want, they know this. And so when you are still doing the little things, going above and beyond, it makes such a big difference. I'll end with this. So I was speaking with a client today out of Long Island, and he said about 15 to 20% of my, of the bookings we're getting from your campaigns are returning to us. By the way, that's very, I'm guessing that's pretty high. I don't think for most of our customers it's that high. But I also know that there might be a few clients that do this. I do not think so. Out of the 130 odd operators we work with, the first time you give service to a local client, okay? So they live in your region. Let's say they fit your ideal avatar, right? Maybe it's they're using your services, and they either own a business or they're in a business, right? And they live, in your target area. If those two things are true, and after the first time you provide service to them, if you aren't giving them a call, you are leaving so much money on the table. It's hard to even explain, because just making that call, it's the same thing as I was talking about earlier. It shows that you care. Virtually, in the age of automation, people that do things manually and pick up the phone and make that call, is it a pain in the butt? I mean, it's work, right? It's not fun. But when you do things that aren't very scalable, that aren't automatable, obviously you can send a text, but people know how much effort goes into those automated texts, which isn't any, really, right? So for those situations, when they meet those criteria and after they've taken their first trip with you, give them a call, thank them for their business, ask them how everything went. Was there anything we could have improved? And by the way, I noticed we took you as such and such. Do you travel often? And just see what they say. And you're not trying to sell the next trip. You're just asking the question. Okay. And you don't even need to follow it up with some pitch, because it will seem like small talk, but you want them to remember you, right? Because it's a loss if that's, if you're doing service for a first-time client who fits your ideal client in your service area, and they book with you, and then 8 months later they forget all about you, which we have email follow-up, and we do lots of other things, but man, nothing is more powerful or memorable than a phone call. If 8 months later they hop on Google to search again for another vendor, then you've kind of like lost, or not lost, but you're leaving lots and lots of money on the table, because repeat clients are what makes marketing for this industry, especially the lower the ticket of the service. So for black car, sedan, SUV, it is not worth running advertising if everyone uses you once. You will lose money. And that is coming from me, where we try to do every single thing along the line, the click-through rate, the landing page conversion rate, the automated follow-ups, the long-term nurture emails, retargeting, everything that we do to get as many people to book as possible. And it's still expensive to acquire a client, even when you do everything correctly. I can say it's just not worth it, even if you do everything right. If the vast majority, so like if 95% only use you one time, probably not worth it, unless that 5%'s, spending very, very big money with you. So the last thing I want to mention is, and I've mentioned this before, but when you are on the phone with someone and it's a new potential client and you want to qualify them, highly recommend you ask them, is this the first time you've used this sort of service before? Because it's the sort of question that's not like, hey, where are you going on your vacation or something? So it's not, and the truth is, it's a great question, right? When I talk to people, I always ask them, have you ever used a marketing agency before? And no matter really probably what industry you're in, especially if you're in one where, it's more of a luxury type service, which this is, you want to know who you're speaking with. And if it's someone who uses them often, then they most likely are familiar with, what the going rates are. And really just the more you can find out, about their specific situation, what the, transportation's for, if you're picking them, are we picking you up at your office or your home? I mean, figuring out if it's, a corporate client or whatever, but that's far and away the most important question that whenever you're on the phone, you should ask. It should be the one of the very first questions you ask is, have you used these kind of services before? And there's probably even a better way to phrase that, but if they say no, then there's a very good chance that they might be surprised when you give them their quote. And that way you're prepared for that, because I feel like one of the more challenging things is when you have several people in a row that are questioning your rates, and it has nothing to do many times with people being cheap. That's not what it is. Everyone wants value. Who wants to overpay for the same thing? So when they say, when you think, everyone's cheap, no, everyone wants value. That's what everyone wants. And so if they're potentially looking for another vendor in your space, then you didn't, set yourself apart enough. And how do you do that? There's lots of ways. I mean, the biggest one's online reputation. Like, how many reviews do you have? What's your star rating? And with those reviews, do you have some really, really killer ones? Because people read reviews. And you generally want reviews from every sort of type of customer avatar. I mean, the best ones are the ones where, they leave a review with a photo. Those are very powerful because we're always looking at, vendors or whatever. And when we're thinking of working with a vendor or whatever, we're trying to picture ourselves with, using their service or whatever. And so if we see someone like us that is very happy with this service, especially if, it's a business client, maybe it's an attorney, and, maybe somehow they mentioned that in the review or whatever. And that's really what you want. And the only way to get that is just a very high volume of reviews. So if you're not doing that, especially if you're a larger operator and your online reputation isn't very good, all I can assume is you have many other ways to acquire clients, because it will only get more important. It's end of April 2025. Reviews will just become more and more important in the future. So highly recommend cleaning up your profile, or if you don't have very many, get over 100 and really get over, for your closest competitors, if they all have 500, you're going to want to get over 500. If all your competitors only have 20, you'd probably be fine with 25. Of course, you want to get more than that, but it's all relative. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope you learned a few things, and I will see you guys on next week's video.